Good afternoon, my CTK family. I hope you can hear me this evening. I just thought the day before Maundy Thursday, or as we call it, Holy Thursday, I would speak to you from just by the side of our church. At Christ the King Church today, it's a beautiful day. And I hope you can enjoy the weather just as I am enjoying the weather this evening. In my letter to my church for this Holy Week, I talked about the extravagance of God's love. You know, the word extravagance is used always in a negative sense. But when it comes to love, that word applies so much to Jesus. Tomorrow, we will celebrate Maundy Thursday, when Jesus would show the extravagance of his love. In fact, St. John the Apostle would introduce the upper room in these words: having loved his own, he loved them to the end. I mean, look at those words. He loved them to the end. Jesus knew as he walked into the upper room, there were all kinds of people. There was the betrayer. There was the future denier. People were in different mindsets in that room. I mean, just imagine, what would you do if you were going to confront your betrayer face to face? If you were going to meet the very man who is going to hand you over to death? That's why St. John introduces it in these terms. Having loved his own, he loved them to the end. As a priest in the last many years, that's one of my prayers. When I go to meet someone, especially someone that I know has a hard time with me, or someone I have a hard time, before I go into that conversation, I pause for a few moments and I remind myself of these words from St. John's Gospel. I tell God, I am walking into the upper room. And this is how they described you. Having loved his own, he loved them to the end. And so tomorrow, everything that we do tomorrow is a celebration of God's extravagant love. He will give them his body and blood. He will stoop down like a servant and wash their feet. He will tell them, I have shown you what love means. Go and do the same again. That's Jesus' teaching. Now, in the upper room, Jesus made no distinction between Peter and Judas, James, John, and Judas. Even though Jesus knew his betrayer, he was so good, so understanding, so loving to Judas. He would take a morsel of bread and dip it into his cup, and then he would give it to Judas. In the ancient Jewish tradition, if a host took a piece of bread and dipped it into his own cup and gave it to the guest, that was a sign of absolute intimacy. And that's what Jesus did to Judas. He was stooped down and washed everybody's feet, including that of Judas. This morning, I spoke to you about Judas in the Mass. Those of you who are with me today, you can go back and check. What happened to Judas? I mean, really, what happened to Judas? I don't want to repeat my sermon again, but I want to talk to you about Judas. Nobody knew where to find Jesus at night because Jesus didn't have a designated address. He could be anywhere with his disciples. But Judas knew. In fact, today I'm going to talk to you a lot of materials from Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen. Fulton J. Sheen once said, "The greatest harm that is done is not always from the enemies, but from those who have been cradled in sacred associations. It is the failure of those within that provides opportunities for enemies without. The enemies will do the bloody work of the crucifixion, but those who have had faith and lost it, and who are anxious to save their consciences by destroying the root of moralities, commit the greatest evil." The sad story: Judas, an insider. Judas, one of his 12. Judas, the man he trusted with his finances. Judas, who sat next to him at the Last Supper. The man to whom he gave the morsel of bread. He is the one who would betray Jesus. Jesus is betrayed not by his enemies, but by the one man he trusted, he loved, the man he looked upon to continue his mission upon the earth. Imagine for a moment the betrayal took place with a kiss. When Judas came into the Garden of Gethsemane with a huge crowd of Jesus' enemies behind him, he came to the Master and said, "Master," and then he kissed him. He bestowed that blistering kiss on his cheek. When wickedness would destroy virtue, and when man would destroy the Son of God, there was always a necessity to profess the evil deed with some mark of affection. Judas would compliment and deny divinity with the same lips. Judas would compliment and would deny divinity with the same lips. Jesus knew. And this is where the extravagance of love of Jesus is manifested. It's overflowing. The only word that came from Jesus face to face with a betrayer is this: friend. Jesus would address Judas as a friend. It was the last time Jesus would speak to Judas. For the moment, for Jesus, for God, he is not the traitor. He's a friend. Even when he came to do the most wicked deed ever done in the history of mankind, for Jesus, he is not a traitor. He is a friend. And so the last word that Jesus speaks to Judas is friend. Just think about it for a moment. As a friend, Judas had the right to the fatted calf, but then he rejected it. Now, as the story progresses, when Judas the traitor saw that Jesus was condemned by Pilate, and then he went through all the abuse, he was going to Mount Calvary, to the cross. Judas felt some sense or remorse. He said, I have brought an innocent man to death. In Matthew chapter 27, verse 3. The condemnation of Jesus had a double effect on Judas. One, Judas felt the sense of remorse. It produced a bondage of guilt through the agony of his conscience. The 30 pieces of silver within his purse were weighing him down. He ran to the temple. He took the 30 pieces of silver and threw it mockingly across the temple floor. To get rid of the very advantage of his betrayal was a sign that he was none the richer for the very thing that he had attained, that he was infinitely poorer because of the way he had gained it. This was the worst moment in Judas' life. This was the worst moment in Judas' life. Those who were associated with him in the crime now attempted to shake off the responsibility for the common act. One of the punishments in concerted sin is mutual recrimination. Whenever men band together to do evil against a good man, they always end by falling out with one another. Judas' fellow conspirators were willing to consult about the money, but not about the innocent man. You know, the chief priests, the religious people should have rejoiced in the confession of Judas and helped him, but they discarded him as a mere tool. He was a tool. He was no longer wanted. Neither was the money. So the money that he threw in the temple was used to buy a field of blood. I want to for a moment look at Judas' sense or remorse. Judas repented unto himself. The Greek word that is used for repenting for Judas is very different from the word used for Peter for repenting. The word used in connection with Judas signifies only a change of feeling, a regret of the consequences, a desire for undoing what had been done. Unfortunately, this kind of repentance does not ask for pardon. Even the devils repented the consequences of their action for the sin of pride. Let's look at what happened to Judas. Before a sin, the devil makes light of it. After a sin, the devil becomes an accuser, inciting despair and worse crimes in the guilty. That's exactly what happened to Judas. Judas was repentant unto himself, not unto the Lord. Let me repeat that again. Judas was repentant unto himself, not unto the Lord. He was disgusted with the effects of his sin, not with the sin itself. He was disgusted with the effects of his sin, not with his sin itself. Everything can be pardoned except the refusal to ask pardon. As life can forgive everything except when you are not repentant truly. Judas' remorse was only self-hatred. He hated himself for what he had done. Judas hated himself for what he had done. And let me tell you one thing. Self-hatred is suicidal. To hate self is the beginning of slaughter. When a man hates himself for what he had done and is without repentance to God, He will sometimes pound his breast as if to blot out a sin. There's a lot of difference between pounding a breast in self-disgust and pounding your breast with sincere mea culpa, in which one asks for pardon. Sometimes self-hatred becomes so intense as even to pound the life out of a man. Sometimes self-hatred becomes so intense as if to pound the life out of a man. And thus leads to suicide. Judas was so full of self-disgust. He was alone. He was alone. He was a betrayer. He had betrayed innocent blood. He had betrayed the man who had loved him with all his heart. He had betrayed the man who had trusted him with everything. Down the valley of Cedron, Judas went. Amid the jagged rocks and gnarled and stunted trees, he was so disgusted with himself that he would empty himself of self. Every branch in that garden was an accusing finger. The very hill on which he stood overlooked Calvary, where the one whom he had betrayed was put to death. Throwing a rope over a limb of a tree, Judas hanged himself as his bowels burst asunder. God can be sold, but he cannot be bought. God can be sold, but he cannot be bought. Judas sold God, and his evil collaborators could not buy him. For God was present again in risen glory on Easter Sunday. It's a very sad story. On one side, you see the extravagance of God. A God who would call Judas, the betrayer, final words, friend. On the other side, you see the rejection of that love. Rejection of that love. He sold his master for 30 pieces of silver, but he could never buy him back. If only he had looked beyond that garden to the tree on Calvary in repentance and sorrow. Let me say that again. If only Judas had looked beyond that garden to the Mount of Calvary, to that tree, in sorrow and repentance, today you and I would have been praying to Saint Judas. You know, We don't know what happened to Judas. Did Judas go to hell? I don't know. I don't know. I am a firm believer in God's extravagant love. I bank on that love. I don't depend on my goodness. I don't know how wretched I am. I can never deserve heaven. I can never deserve heaven. And so if you ask me, where is Judas? I don't know. But I count on God's extravagant love. Would Judas be swept in this extravagance of God's love? Absolutely. But that's a question that I want you to answer, not me. I personally believe in God's love. I believe that His love is extravagant. And I bank, I count on His love. With these words, I want to thank you for joining me this evening. I'll go back and put my camera on the tabernacle, and I invite you to pray a few moments in silence, and then invite you to join me and Father Brian Timoney for the 6 p.m. prayer and the Holy Rosary. Thank you.